Well, the Honourable Andrew Hastie MP, Federal Member for Canning and Shadow Minister for Home Affairs, welcome to the NACON Australia podcast.
Great to talk to you, Dan.
Yeah. I read a fair bit about you, and I know you are an admirer and very well read on US President Abraham Lincoln. As you would be familiar, the speech which first brought Lincoln to national prominence was something called the Lyceum Address, in which he warned that the real threat to the American Republic would not come from abroad, but would only ever come from within. You've had senior responsibilities in and out of government for defence and domestic security matters. In your view today, do the greatest threats to Australia come from abroad or from within?
It's a great question, Dan. I think it's a combination of both. I think if we're weak, we are vulnerable to threats from without. But if we're less cohesive, if we're more divided internally, if we're governed by people who don't appreciate the strategic competition that's taking place, we're also going to be very weak within. And so it's both and, not either or. That's my starting premise. So as much as I care about being ready to defeat adversaries who would threaten our sovereignty, our prosperity, I think we've got to do as much work as possible on the state of our democracy, our institutions, all the way from our parliament down to our families, which are the sort of the bedrock of Australian society.
Do you think there's been an overemphasis on foreign conflicts rather than the threats at home? David Betts is a professor at King's College London and one of the leading experts on civil war globally. He recently was on the podcast circuit and provocatively said that there's a very high potential for major civil unrest in the UK within the next 5 years. Does Australia face the same risks? And if not, why not?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting debate going on. I read James Orr's op-ed in the UK Daily Telegraph, I think it was over the weekend, or this week even, where he talked about, he responded to Charles Moore, who had a go at him and said, we need to start caring more about Kent than Kiev. Charity begins at home was the argument that he was mounting. And so as a veteran of the forever wars, and by that I mean Afghanistan, I never deployed to Iraq, but I certainly had to be involved in the cleanup with the rise of ISIS over 2014, 2015 when I did my last deployment to Jordan. As a veteran of the forever wars, I have an email from 2009 when I was first deployed to Uruzgan province in Afghanistan. I wrote back to family and some friends and I said, what the heck are we doing here? I couldn't make sense of it. Of course, we were there because of the US alliance, but I didn't understand the strategic end game with the war at that time. There was a massive surge. As you remember, Obama had just become president. I was watching C-17 after C-17 land as the US built this bigger footprint in Uruzgan province. 1 week there was nothing but sand in one area of the base. The next week there was a massive dining facility where you could eat all sorts of ice cream imported straight from the US. Incredible, the logistical footprint. And I still remember thinking, what are we actually doing here? And China was starting to really grow as a country, I think, back then. And I was thinking, we should be working on our own region and working on our own country. And so when I flew back and I remember seeing the red earth of Australia, just having this intense desire to preserve what we have. And when you drive on our streets after being over somewhere like Afghanistan, you just appreciate the order, the rule of law, all those things which we take for granted. And so I had this really intense desire to focus on Australia, which is why I joined the Liberal Party, which is partly why I ended up in Parliament 2 years later, or a couple of years later, I should say.
Maybe it's worth fleshing that out a little bit more because you, as you say, you admirably joined the military after September 11th and bravely fought in Afghanistan with the SAS. Many young Australians and many young others died in that conflict in other parts of the Middle East over the last 30 years. And whether those Western-led interventions were successful is, at the very least, highly debatable. How have your views on foreign policy changed, if at all, since you first enlisted?
I think I was unconsciously someone who believed in the Whig version of history. So I come out of university and I believe that this ideological notion of freedom, which was very abstract, could be implanted in other countries. and I didn't fully appreciate how resilient culture and geography and language are to foreign interventions. So I remember George Bush's 2005 inaugural address, where he talked about this kind of abstract freedom moving through the world.
Mm.
Um, and so for me, when I got to actually do it at the pointy end overseas, I realized its severe limitations,
Really? Yeah.
and that kind of cured me of that thinking. So now I'd say I'm very much a realist. I'm very much a conservative. I read a lot of Edmund Burke when I got back, a lot of Roger Scruton when I got back, and I've got a very healthy regard for the resilience of local institutions. And also, I'm very skeptical about the ability of unelected governments, whether they be occupying forces like we were in Afghanistan or Iraq, to actually change hearts and minds. I mean, that's not the point of government, right? The government doesn't change hearts and minds. It's from a Christian perspective, at least, which is partly or mostly what shapes my worldview. Is that government's there to uphold justice. It has a coercive role, but it can't actually change what people think and feel. Of course, that's what you get with authoritarian governments. That's why they have surveillance states to support them, because they are interested in changing people's hearts and minds.
Yeah, when they can never, they do it with mixed results even then. JD Vance, the thoughtful US vice president, he said that there's nothing radical about having a strong national security, so that when we go to war, we punch and we punch hard, but we need to be cautious and not trying to get involved in any far-flung corner of the world. Sometimes it's none of our business and we ought to stay out of it. That's a very different sentiment to that George W. Bush inaugural of 2005, right? But I feel like that sentiment of JD Vance's isn't yet shared amongst the sort of political class in Australia. How should Australia decide what conflicts we should get involved in future?
Well, I think we got involved in Iraq and Afghanistan because of the alliance. And so, in a sense, we're a price taker, not a price maker, on a lot of these larger geostrategic questions. Great powers do grand strategy. The rest of us just respond. And in a sense, Australia has always been the beneficiary of a English-speaking democratic global power. First the British, now the American system that arose out of the end of the Second World War. And so, in a sense, we get shaped a lot by the United States, which is why, for a lot of our policy-making elite, this transition under Trump is so disorientating. We've been the beneficiary of US power. The freedom of the seas has been underwritten by US naval power. Our lines of communication, those 15 submarine cables, which move 99% of our data to and from this country, are protected by US naval power. And so it's kind of hard. And I think, as the US President Donald Trump emphasizes America first in many of these questions, I think we also have to start asking the question ourselves: what does Australia first look like on on foreign policy questions?
Mm. But I think that realist school has certainly now achieved greater prominence, right? Because the guys who were making the arguments about not to go into Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya and all these places back in the day weren't, they were not listened to. And like I were, I was kind of all for it. We've got to get rid of
Yeah,
Saddam and
yeah.
God knows who else. And gradually, as the sort of fruits of those conflicts come out, you do have to reassess. But I still feel as though in Australia we haven't adjusted our thinking in the same, and are inherently hostile at many levels in government to that let's call it the realist perspective coming out of the Trump administration.
Yeah. And it's confronting for us, because all of a sudden this sacred cow of the alliance
Mm.
is being reshaped by President Trump. And
Mm.
that's disorientating, because the alliance has been believed to be sacrosanct, but instead it's
Mm.
not. It's now being
Yeah.
shaped very much by realist considerations, the US national interest. And that's confronting, because the question has to be asked, well, what does that mean for us if some sort of conflict was to break out in the Indo-Pacific? Would the cavalry from the US come to our aid? And I think history is a good guide here. The US didn't enter Second World War immediately. They took quite some time. And it wasn't until the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese in 41 that the US actually entered the war. So there's a deeply isolationist strain within the GOP in the United States. And I think we're struggling to come to terms with it as a country because it has implications for our security and prosperity. But when you think about it, the US is about 5% of the world's population. It might be even less than that. It's about 25% of the world's GDP, but 50% of the world's military. And they can't keep carrying the cost of that. Um, there are unlimited demands for US global power, but there's only a very limited supply of it. And the US is increasingly in debt. Their interest payments are through the roof, and they can't keep policing the world. And that has implications for us, which is why the US is calling on Europe to increase its defense spending. It's calling on us to increase our defense spending. And people don't like change fundamentally, particularly when it has fiscal implications.
Mm. One of the last pieces of advice that Winston Churchill gave his cabinet before finally stepping down was that we must never get out of step with the Americans. Never. But on not only on foreign policy, but also on trade in Australia, we are out of step with the Americans, right? Um, Robert Lighthizer, Trump's former trade representative and a guy who knows more about trade policy than probably all the trade ministers currently in the world combined, said it is no exaggeration to say that the future of the United States hinges on a continued shift in our trade policy. Why has there been no fundamental reassessment of trade policy in Australia?
It's a really good question. I think because we're making so much money through our exports to China. It's easy, it's addictive, and it's the basis for a lot of prosperity here in Western Australia. A lot of mortgages here depend upon iron ore and gas and other critical resources that we export around the world. I spent 2 days in the Pilbara this week. Went up to Woodside, went up to BHP, choked on the red dust at Port Hedland as BHP was emptying the 850,000 tons that they do every 24 hours into the ships that were headed to China and elsewhere. And just reminded, there is a lot of momentum for our exports, and that momentum is going to keep driving that trade. So this is the challenge. I said this back it was 2019 in an op-ed. I said, every single foreign policy question going forward will be refracted through the geopolitical competition between the United States and the People's Republic of China. And 6 years later, that still holds true in my view.
Yeah. It's such a unique situation Australia is in, really, in historical terms. We have this cash generator in the Pilbara, which most of Australians have never been to. I haven't been to it despite having a long lost, ancestors who ended up sort of opening up that country. And we rely on China, a strategic adversary, for our bread and butter, but we rely on another longtime friend for us, security. And I struggle to think of any other historical analogy to that. Can you think of one where the commercial and the strategic um, goals have been so misaligned?
Yeah, it's a bit like the Malians having a trade relationship with,
Athenians, yeah.
yeah, and and depending upon the Spartans for military security, we're kind of the Melian dialogue applies to us in many respects. We're much smaller than both countries. We're tiny compared to both countries, and we're resource rich, and which is why a lot of our foreign policy and business leaders would prefer it if things just stayed the same. And because Donald Trump's the first president who's actually said, you know what, we can't keep bearing the costs of um, guaranteeing global security. We can't keep carrying the costs of these trade agreements that are more beneficial to our partners than us. That's why he's rebalancing the terms of trade and security, and that upsets the very finely tuned arrangements that we have right now with China and the United States.
Don't we need a bigger industrial base here in Australia to have any sort of control over our own destiny. I mean, economic sovereignty is a somewhat subjective sort of term, but we have less, about 5%, depending on how you count, of our economy, which is involved in manufacturing. If we lose the metal processing industry, which seems like a real risk in places like Queensland and WA, Tasmania, that potentially goes down to 3%. That's below sub-Saharan African levels of economic complexity. And isn't it a national security risk? Because by and large, more industrialized powers beat less industrialized powers in history. We are a very deindustrialized power.
We are. I still remember I was in Florida back in 2014, and I was having a drink with a retired CIA officer who spent 30 years doing financial disruption. We're talking about the Australian economy, and I said, "Oh, how do you see us?" And he said, "Oh, you're a first world country with a third world economy." And it was like that. He didn't have to think about it. Um, and what he was hinting at was that there wasn't a lot of complexity back then, and here we are 11 years later. And not a lot has changed. In fact, you could argue we've further deindustrialized with the closure of the Ford plants down in Geelong. We don't have an auto industry anymore. I really worry about this. This is one of the things that really keeps me up at night. Countries throughout the Asia Pacific region all protect, subsidize their industrial bases because they see it as a key input to national power. If you want to generate combat power to deter an enemy, you've actually got to be able to make that combat power. Otherwise, you're completely reliant on someone else for that combat power. At the moment, we have a very small defense industry. And we're relying on America for a lot of our hardware. We're going to be reliant on the Japanese for our future frigates. And they're long supply lines that are exposed potentially in wartime. So I think we should have an industrial base, and we could have an industrial base, except for the fact that we are deconstructing an efficient, cheap energy grid powered by Aussie coal and gas, and we're replacing it with a very expensive, inefficient power grid, which will be effectively powered by imported Chinese industrial scale solar and wind farms. It's just insane.
Well, transported on diesel-powered ships, right? So
on diesel-powered ships, and firmed by only 15 gigawatts of gas-fired power by 2050, which will be backed up by diesel.
It's insane. Yeah. Look, net zero has become this totemic issue, which, hot off the press, just got voted against at the LNP convention here in Brisbane. And I know the same thing happened in Perth recently. It's an obviously terrible policy in my view, but most of the deindustrialization in Australia occurred prior to that being introduced. And even if we got rid of all carbon dioxide related commitments tomorrow, which politically I don't think is going to happen, can Australia hope to have any sort of serious manufacturing sector as long as we have a trade agreement supported on a bipartisan basis with China that allows 100% of manufactured goods to come in duty free?
Yeah, I think this is where we're very, very slow to pick up what's happening around the world. Most countries, even Europe, protects their manufacturing sector. And this is where the sort of abstract neoliberal free market fundamentalism has really damaged our country over the last 40 years. And we're yet to see the correction, although people on the street are very concerned about this sort of stuff. But this is why I consider myself a conservative, and I'm also very pragmatic, right? What's the best for Australia? If all the other countries out there are protecting their advanced manufacturing, why wouldn't we consider doing something similar to protect ours if it's so critical to our national sovereignty, our economic sovereignty? So that's a really good point you make there, Dan. Even if we turned on cheap electricity, could we expect to compete with, say, China? Obviously, it would be very, very difficult. I think the real challenge will be the artificial intelligence revolution and what that means for countries like China, which have effectively benefited from wage arbitrage that's been conducted by multinationals across the world, basically moving their factories and their jobs to cheaper jurisdictions like China, Thailand, Vietnam, India. What happens when artificial intelligence means that the same things that are produced in Asia can now be produced in Australia using automation and cheaply? Does that mean that we recover some of our advanced manufacturing? These are the sorts of questions we need to be thinking about.
Yeah, to say to my sort of centre right buddies, Ohio has nuclear power. Ohio has cheaper tax rates than Australia. Ohio has a much more flexible labour regime than we probably could ever hope for. And yet, and still, because of the trade policy since China joined the WTO, so many factory jobs left that place and ended up setting up in Shenzhen and Shanghai and other places as well, and then shipping the goods back to the US. And you've got a vice president from Ohio who has seen the reality of that. So
Yeah.
you can't think that we're going to be do a better job in Ohio than Australia will do a better job than Ohio without a change in trade policy. So it's very hard to get through to people who have grown up with that whole mythology of the 1980s, which had a lot of good stuff going for it. I'm not getting me wrong. You tack with the times, but it's not 1985 and Paul Keating debating with John Howard in Parliament. The times have changed.
Well, precisely, and it's kind of interesting when you think about it. That the same economic reforms happened in the US.
Mm,
They happened in the UK under Margaret Thatcher, and they happened under Bob Hawke and Paul Keating. But the Anglosphere was transitioning at that point in time. Whether it
mm,
was John Howard or Bob Hawke in the
mm,
seat, it probably would have happened under either of them.
mm,
And so the point I come back to is, as a junior partner in the alliance, when America sneezes, we generally catch a cold, and we're seeing that with reform in the UK. Nigel Farage is quite pragmatic, but he's advocating for a lot of Trump-style policies.
mm.
And I wouldn't be surprised if those policies they start to get mainstreamed as well. When we wake up and we think, you know what, when are we going to start acting in our national interest? When are we going to start looking after Australians, putting Australians first? And if we adopt that mantra, if we adopt that message, then you've got to put in place policies that actually look after Australian industry, Australian people. And it's going to be very, very disorientating for people who are far too ideological on these economic questions. They've just adopted sort of the economics 101 framework. That's the gospel. And this is what will lead to prosperity. When instead, in all things, you've got to be fairly flexible and pragmatic about these things.
You adjust with the times. I say to people, it makes perfect sense if the world was just one big economic zone and there was no competition between nations and nations didn't exist. But that world never existed and will never exist. So the premise on which you're proceeding doesn't sort of apply. And even it's quite interesting. I think the age we live in is quite similar to the late 19th century, when Britain was the top dog and was preaching unilateral free trade and had Germany as its major trading partner, and you could never have a war because they were such close trading partners. And in Australia, you had people that were like, we want tariffs on British goods because
Yeah,
we need an industrial base here. Sure, we might earn more money selling them wool, but we're an independent nation. We need to have some sovereign capacity to make things. And Menzies wanted, much as he loved the Queen and all that, he was in favour of tariffs on British goods. What he would have thought having a free trade agreement with China and having manufactured goods coming into it boggles the mind, right?
totally. And a lot of liberals these days look back at Menzies and they bolt on,
Mm,
our preoccupations with economics. And he wasn't some sort of doctrinaire free marketeer. He was Keynesian. When he defeated Chifley, he pretty much kept in place a lot of the mandarins who were running the public service.
mm,
He didn't do a lot of supply side reform. He kept things as they were because, of course, he was responding to the challenges of the time in the same way that after the 70s with stagflation and all the rest of it, a supply side reform agenda made sense in the 80s, which is what
mm.
we got. But now
Yeah.
things have changed again. And, you know, we've got to think about how to preserve our sovereignty, and that includes our economic sovereignty.
you tack with the times like, great America's Cup skippers, and when I'm not a
100%
sailor.
trim
I'm
those
sure
sails.
you put the spinnaker up when the times are good, but you need to sort of pull it down when the times are slightly different. You take advantage of the times. Another one of these issues, which I always say trade, immigration, and foreign policy are some of the key areas where there's been there's a difference between the 1990s right and the Trump era. So immigration is another one, right? And uh, polls in Australia for a long time have indicated strong support for significantly reducing immigration. Yet, for an equally long time, here and across the West, there's been a failure by mainstream parties to address that. Why is that?
I think because mainstream parties have been lobbied by big business, by the universities, and they've also been um, controlled in a sense that you know to oppose unlimited immigration is to be somewhat racist. I mean, these are the tropes you hear all the time on social media. This is how people try and shut down debate when people question our ridiculous net overseas migration figures of the last 3 years. If you question it, you must be a racist. You mustn't like people from other countries and all the rest of it. Whereas I think it's completely legitimate, and I think this is the one issue where the major parties face the gravest threat for disruption, because if we don't respond to what people are feeling and seeing every single day, whether it's being locked out of the housing market or whether it's the social cohesion they're worried about, if we have a Nigel Farage-like character who springs up and starts making some cogent arguments for cutting immigration, I tell you what, there's a lot of people who are gonna move to that person and that party if it arises.
Yeah. I mean, the Tory party, the UK Conservatives, got almost completely wiped out. And I think the view was that was largely because they had lost control of legal immigration, not just stopping the boats and stuff, but the
Yeah,
mass numbers of people that have come in. Some of the figures sort of boggle the mind. In the last 20 years, there have been more people migrated to the UK than in the last 2,000 years. And,
yeah,
that's unreal. And 12 of those years that the Tories were in charge. So people, I think, understandably, view very cynically any language rhetoric alone about cutting. They want to see it actually happen, and I think they're trying to tack over there. And we haven't seen reform style thing here in Australia, but there is gradual sort of simmering, well, widespread, but simmering discontent that hasn't found a vehicle really. Um, there is an increasing radicalism among the youth across the Western world. Some are going
mm,
left, some are going right. Some blame this development on our education system, it's too woke or something, or social media, or an allegation that young people are somehow not as hardworking as their baby boomer sort of forebears. But isn't the dissatisfaction understandable if they do not have what their parents had, a reasonable prospect of getting on the property ladder in their 20s, so they can form a family and support it on a single income and have a real stake in the country?
yeah. I'm so sympathetic to young people. As conservatives, we believe that human nature is constant throughout history. So, do young Australians at the moment have the same capacity to excel as all Australians throughout history? Absolutely. Do they have the same capacity to fail as all Australians throughout history? Absolutely, they do. Do they have the same opportunity? That's the real question. And I think this is where a lot of the issue lies. I'm not sure they've had the same opportunity. I think the institutions have failed them, and they're reacting against that. And no political settlement is permanent. It's subject to change. And I think what we're seeing is young Australians kicking back on the political settlement because what it feels like not only has the door closed on them, but the ladder's been pulled up as well. And the prospect of buying a home, starting a family, having a stake in the country feels very remote for many of them.
Yeah, I think I heard you say when you were door knocking, you came across a couple and she called you the uni party because despite the fact that they were educated and she had a young child, they just didn't think they had a real prospect of being able to you know get on the housing ladder. Um,
Yeah, I love door knocking. It's just the quickest way to get to the heart of what what people are thinking, right? And I knock on the door. She's there in a pink dressing gown, baby on her hip, toddler by her side, and introduced myself. She was very friendly. And then I said, "Oh, I'm from the Liberal Party." "Oh, the Uniparty." "Yeah, the other guys come around here recently and knocked as well." Talked about how her husband had an MBA, had been in the army. She was a midwife on maternity leave, no hope of ever buying a home. And as we dug deeper, it came back to immigration.
Yeah, right.
Just that sense that the government's not looking after Australians, and Australians who are citizens deserve a fair go. A fair go is what she didn't feel she was getting from the system. And that's why she was looking for someone other than the Uniparty to vote for.
Yeah, and that term's thrown around, and sometimes it's unfair. But if you look at what I call a key issues, trade, immigration, and foreign policy, both parties have supported mass immigration, and the Liberal Party has been maybe a little bit sort of more keen to cut the edges, but not in any substantial way. On trade, like I said, bipartisan support for not only China trade agreement, that open borders trade with a whole lot of different people, and on foreign policy, there's still been no, I think, fundamental change in that, what I call like the George W. Bush type of outlook, where we're going to get involved in every single conflict on the planet, because regardless of our sort of capacity and the ability to actually affect real change, but simply because it's the right thing to do, as Tony Blair liked to say.
Yeah. Immigration, lots of it at least, uncontrolled immigration under Labor, but you're right to point out that, our record is mixed as well. It just means that you depress wages. There's more people competing for jobs, and of course the Treasury likes the revenue through the visas. The universities certainly love the foreign students. I mean, they're making a mozza. Let's be clear right here. The universities have a huge vested interest in keeping my immigration levels as high as they are, and you can see why people are feeling increasingly upset and dislocated from their own country. That's not because they're racist. That's just because they're Australian, and this is their home. They deserve a say in how it's governed. And the problem with a lot of these free trade agreements or strategic comprehensive partnerships, whatever you want to call them, is that there's a whole bunch of things agreed between the two countries that are never actually ventilated or debated in Parliament. It's an outsourcing of parliamentary diligence and rigour to bureaucrats, and then it's just slammed through the Parliament, and then all this stuff is happening, and people don't know why, or it's never been explained to them.
Yeah, and there are consequences, and there's a dynamic where you can see why it benefits certain industries, real estate, hospitality, and other thing, and agriculture to some extent too. And it gets the added bonus that they get to take the moral high ground. Oh, we're getting rich, and we also get to be really tolerant and understanding about people from different parts of the world, which obviously everyone kind of is, but there are
Not in our
consequences.
neighbourhood. Not in our neighbourhood.
That's right. They don't have to wear the real harm to the challenges that poses to particular parts of the country.
Yeah, definitely. And so I think this is energy policy, immigration policy, family policy, industrial policy. These are key areas. This is where the future fights are going to happen. And as much as the major parties might want to look back and wish for a return to the sort of stability of the last 30 years, we ain't going back. The cork is out of the bottle, and we've got to deal with what we have before us.
And it needs to be explained in a coherent way, not just otherwise people will react in rage or react in non-thoughtful ways. So I just do think there's a responsibility on the major parties to get their heads around this and to explain what was wrong, where the changes need to happen, and then do them, implement them.
That's right. And I think reading some of the leading thinkers in the US is really important. I gave a speech at the Indo-Pacific Security Conference last July. I was over in Tennessee, in Nashville. I was actually, where was I at the time? The time of the assassination. Assassination attempt of Donald Trump. Yeah. I was in Georgia. I'd gone to do some Civil War battlefield tours with my son and some family members, and we got the news on the way back to Nashville. and I think it was Chickamauga, and we'd been in there for the day.
Yeah.
And I walked into this restaurant. This guy's like, "Someone's just tried to shoot the president." You know, it was this really intense moment. And in Nashville, where we'd been, there hadn't been many Trump signs out on the front lawns, and then the next week, bang, Trump signs came out. Like
Really?
it primal spirit there. Anyway, I came back. I was at a bookshop, Barnes and Noble in Nashville, and I picked up Pete Navarro's book.
Oh, yeah.
Um, and it was like the Deplorables Guide to the MAGA Agenda or something. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I read it. It was pretty much, tariffs with aggressive supply side reform, internal to the US economy.
Mm.
I remember getting up, giving this speech, and mentioning Pete Navarro, who was center stage of the Republican National Convention. He made that rock star appearance after coming out of jail. And I remember the audience just thinking, Pete Navarro, who's this guy? And then sure enough, him and Robert Lighthizer and Lighthizer's successor have been influential
Mm.
in shaping the US agenda on this sort of stuff. So we've, people like Oren Cass at American Compass, Pete Navarro, Lighthizer, they're all very important because they are shaping the currents of thinking within the GOP.
In a thoughtful way. I actually wrote an op-ed in The Australian on Pete Navarro back in 2016, would you believe? When
Yeah. Wow.
because they pulled him out of sort of obscurity because they needed people to staff the first Trump administration. And he's a bit of an odd cat. I mean, he's a Californian. He's actually pretty green in some ways, but he was the only guy with a PhD from Harvard with rigor that really thought, these books on he wrote about the trash coming out of China and the strategic competition. So he was ahead of the curve, and has certainly been influential. And whether you like him or not, or whether you think with all these personalities that come out of the States, and they are kind of larger than life, you sort of have to like push past the antics and think about what they're actually saying in many cases. And I don't think we do that well in Australia.
No, and their proximity to power.
Yeah.
These people have influence, and sure enough, it was Navarro who was shaping the president. He had the president's ear. I don't keep up with the court politics of the Trump White House,
Yeah.
but nonetheless, American Compass, Oren Cass, his work has been very significant. The Once and Future Worker, I read, very, very substantial economic work. And interestingly, with Oren Cass, he was Mitt Romney's economics advisor. I mean, I think he was McKinsey or Boston Consulting, or he was one of those guys. And now he's advocating for industrial policy. And the Wall Street Journal is regularly chipping him for his his views. But it's fascinating to watch, isn't it?
Yeah. Just to change sort of gears slightly, we live in an increasingly fragmented media landscape, and I increasingly find that people's outlook varies depending on where they get their news. Not just what paper they read, but what social media they're on, or whether they're on YouTube or internet. What does your daily media diet consist of?
My daily media diet, I actually just have my team scrape the internet for the major paper stuff, and then I check Insta, see what people are talking about, and I'll dive in where necessary, but it's usually the Oz, AFR, the Nine paper.
Do you use that?
I'm not on X. Like, I've never been on X, and I just found, as a policymaker, I just kept going down rabbit holes. You get on X, and I'd love to be in some of those debates, but I know what my true north is. That's why I don't read the comments on Insta or Facebook. I know what my true north is, and I know where I'm going. And if people want to have a crack at me, fine. I'll hear what you have to say. But in the end, I need clarity of mind, and sifting through endless social media, I don't think is healthy.
No, I think you have to strike a balance. I do think, though, that Trump's secret weapon in 2016 was him being on X, not just the broadcasting ability and the ability to make news, but he got advance warning of debates that were happening and the different perspectives and things that were bubbling up. Whereas
I agree with you.
Yeah.
I totally agree with you. And that's why Insta particularly is helpful. And X is helpful in its own way. I obviously don't have an account on X, but I have an account on Insta, and just tracking what young Australians particularly are thinking and feeling is really, really important. And I think what you'll see, if you look closely enough, is you'll see a lot of frustration with immigration policy. That is definitely a real and living thing on social media.
Mm. Again, to change tack slightly, many of us have younger friends and family who have expressed an interest in joining the Australian military, like you did. What role or areas would you suggest they focus on to have a rewarding career in the future? What can be done to make this a more attractive option?
I encourage young Australians to join the ADF. I hear a lot of people say, "Oh, it's too woke. Why would I want to join that?"
Mm,
And my view is, well, hold on a second. We have this amazing tradition of Anzac that is more than a century old. You can be part of it, and the institution itself is only as good as the people in it. So, if you're passionate for your country, if you're a patriot, and you want to serve, even if it's for 4 years, put your hand up. It's life changing, and the friendships and the challenges and the experiences are second to none. And so I'd encourage young people to do it. Think about your gifting and where your interests lie. Not everyone can be a fighter pilot, but if you've got the gifting for it, go for it. We need more fighter pilots. We've got a shortage of fighter pilots. If you reckon you can hack it on a submarine, which is a very elite job in the
mm,
ADF,
mm,
then go for it. And if you're like me, you love people, you love soldiering, physical
mm,
challenges, then the army is a great career as well. For hands-on sort of stuff, you can't go past infantry and special forces. Uh, but there's emerging capabilities in air defense, which has been very critical in the fight in Ukraine. There's emerging capabilities in drone warfare, cyber warfare, and you know, all that stuff is fascinating. If you've got a bent for technology,
mm,
for coding, for the application of AI, there's a whole range of emerging capabilities where you can be used. The thing I
mm,
want people to think about with the ADF is it's not a lifetime of service. Once you remember the ADF, you're always a veteran.
mm,
Uh, and I want Australia to be in a place like Israel where people don't ask you in Israel what university you went to. They ask
mm,
you which unit you served in the IDF. And I'd love for young Australians to be proud of their service and for the Australian people to acknowledge that.
mm. Yeah, interesting. And because it's a truism that the future war never looks like the last one. You know, the guys who were fighting in the trenches in World War One couldn't have really imagined the Battle of Midway, where the aircraft carriers never saw each other.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
so how do you, if you were going to join, like I said, friends and family interested in this stuff, how do you position yourself to, or you just go in and get the basic training and work it out once you're on the inside?
We're looking for entrepreneurs, people who can get inside an institution and be entrepreneurial, and find new solutions. The American military has often been sort of criticized for not having a doctrine. The reason they don't have a doctrine is they're very pragmatic. You know,
Mm,
war is about winning. You
mm,
can't lose wars. If you lose wars, you're conquered, you're defeated. You've got to win. So to win, you've got to be pragmatic and constantly adapting. People talk about the OODA loop, which is observe, orientate, decide, act. And it's this cycle. If you cycle through the OODA loop faster than your adversary, you generally will defeat them.
mm,
And I think more than ever, with the impact that technology is having on the ADF, we need people who are entrepreneurial, who can adapt and cycle very, very quickly, and who are competitive, right? The ADF
mm,
is not a social test tube. It's not someone. It's not an institution we want people joining for the benefits. Although
mm,
there are many, I won't outline them here, but there are many benefits. We want people who want to win, who want to defend their country.
mm,
And so I say to people, hey, if you don't want a tough challenge, don't join the ADF. We want hard people who
mm.
want to win. That's the bottom line.
There's some person in a potential country adversary, young guy or girl, um, who is competing hard,
Yeah,
and
and
they in the military, and they are the ones who we're benchmarking ourselves against, for potential,
and
God forbid, future conflict.
that's right. And young Australians, they want a challenge. They want a quest, right? They want to do something that's bigger than themselves.
Mm,
And we all have fears. I remember on SA selection, the fears were immense. I remember getting dragged out of bed at like 2:30 in the morning, and we're doing push-ups, and we did 60 cadence push-ups. So if you've done push-ups before, most people just pump them out at speed. Cadence
Mm.
push-ups are slow, deliberate, so you fatigue more quickly. And we did 60 cadence push-ups. And I remember getting to the end of that set, you're thinking, oh, how am I going to keep going? They said, we're going to do another 60. And I remember failing, right? And my arms just wouldn't work. And I looked up and everyone else was failing too. And that was the moment when I thought, okay, everyone's going through the same thing. I've just got to keep putting one foot in front of the other. And so for young Australians who think, oh, how could I ever be a soldier or a sailor or an airman? I just say, everyone feels the same way. Just keep moving, keep driving, don't stop, because that's what matters most. Ticker.
You mentioned Australia's never lost a war. Well, let's put it in a different way. In 1961, the first sitting American president visited Australia, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and he described us in sort of laudatory terms, as Americans love to do, as having the deepest, broadest middle class in the world. Now, all nations have their flaws, but we, I think, can legitimately claim at that stage of being the most successful nation on earth, and perhaps in all of history. We'd never lost a war. We'd never had a civil war. We're not racked by ethnic tensions. It was arguably the safest place to be a Jew or an other minority in the 20th century. No small thing. We had a strong industrial capacity. We had manageable debt levels. We had healthy fertility rates, high marriage rates, high property ownership rates, and we had a fiercely egalitarian culture at that time. You can be nostalgic, and obviously there's been advantages and positive developments since that time, but I don't think you can make the same claims on all those things now as you can then. What went what changed? What went wrong? And how can we rebind the nation into that cohesive um, entity that we once had?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's fascinating when you think about our history, not having lost a war nor had a civil war, although you could argue we were the beneficiaries of the English Civil War and then the Restoration and the Glorious Revolution of, 1688, 89. But Australia is a unique experiment. Look, this is the glue that we're all searching for. We're increasingly fractured and divided as a people. Our worldviews don't align, and this is the risk of having groups of people who don't even believe in Australia. You get separatist movements. You get people who want to self-govern within Australia. And so the quest, I think, is for a glue that binds us all. And it comes back to values and identity. Who are we as a people? What do we stand for? And what do we want to do in the future? And if we don't articulate those three things, and if we don't have a consensus around those three things, then we'll be hopelessly divided. And I think that should be the project of the centre-right movement going forward. More foundational than economics. It's defining who we are, what we believe, and where we want to go.
Yeah, people on the centre right, when they're in a academic mood, always like to quote Edmund Burke and others. But I always say, Benjamin Disraeli is the guy to read up on, because his criticisms of the late 19th century open borders liberalism and the need to bind a nation together, and the responsibility that the leading the rich have to the working poor, and the fact that we don't want to create a society of cosmopolitans in capital cities, which he would have called, he would have recognized as the Teals today, right? Because that the whole thing that was going on then is sort of playing out in a different way now here in Australia.
That's right. And I think the settlement is breaking down, or it is already broken. I just don't think it's really been reflected in our politics yet. But the rise of smaller minor parties, that is the clearest signal yet that people are unhappy with the direction of the country. The other thing I'd say as well is that, democracy is a cultural experiment. You need cultural preconditions for democracy to arise. It doesn't just arise in a cultural vacuum, which is why it failed in a lot of the countries that the US has tried to export it to. There are cultural preconditions, and the dignity of the individual, respect for minority views, a fair go, rule of law, the Westminster system itself recognises that people tend to concentrate power for themselves. The plebiscite of 2017, I never ever again want to do a plebiscite. I think that was a huge mistake. I think it was a massive mistake. Referendum, sure, but a plebiscite, if I had my time again, I would have said, let's bring it on and let's have a debate in the parliament and let every elected representative vote their conscience on this issue. Instead, I think we saw a lot of ugliness in that debate. And our democracy works best when it's channeled, when its impulses and its energy is channeled through the established institutions. The plebiscite, in my view, was a big mistake. I think it allowed all sorts of ugliness. It tended towards majoritarianism, whereas I'm a big believer in the Westminster system, having elected representatives decide these issues. So if I had my time again, I would insist on us having a debate within the parliament, going to a vote, every member, every senator exercising their conscience on this issue. And I think our democracy functions best when the impulses of the people, the views of the people are best channeled and directed through the existing institutions. And I think the plebiscite was an aberration of that. And that's why it's made me more of a conservative about the institutions that we have in place.
Yeah. Just going back to that Lyceum speech of Abraham Lincoln's, he does say at the end of it, if destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. Making the point that we can survive a lot, but ultimately republics die, when people don't take responsibility for what they need to do to ensure they endure.
Yeah, exactly. It's a garden. You've got to tend the weeds, you've got to cultivate the soil, you've got to water the plants, and we've got to be gardening. And my worry is that this current generation hasn't seen the garden flourish. They haven't been taught how to garden themselves, and we're at risk of having a whole generation neglect the garden or even despise the garden. And that would be terrible, which is why we're seeing in the polling, in the research, that young Australians are not overly enchanted with democracy, and they're looking for other ways.
Final question, mate. I've been impressed with a lot of people from WA and even the WA division of the Liberal Party, even though Caroline Deruso owes me lunch, and we probably could do with some from more GST money from your side of the continent. Paint a positive picture for WA over the next 20 years.
Positive picture for WA over the next 20 years. I think that we have a real opportunity to build some value add into our exports. I think if we're smart, we could strike some preferential trade agreements or bilaterals with our partners who are in desperate need of securing critical minerals that aren't routed through strategic competitors like China. We have an abundance of those critical minerals. So I think there's some real opportunity there in our resources sector. I think there's an opportunity to do some advanced manufacturing. We'll see that with our shipbuilding program, but that's going to need a reliable supply of energy. And I think then there's AUKUS as well, which, if it's fully realised and it's fully articulated to the Australian people here, a whole supply chain is built out, and a whole range of new jobs are created. And there's also the possibility, I think, of the AI revolution really taking hold here with the establishment of data centres. Those things can only happen, though, if we get cheap, reliable baseload power. And at the moment, the state Labor government, the federal Labor government are rushing towards dismantling all our comparative advantages in the energy space.
Yeah. I have a brother who's working in Singapore for Microsoft building data centers, and he says we should and could be building a lot more here, but it's difficult because of the reasons you described.
We've got the geological stability, we've got the proximity to Asia, and we could attract people here. I had someone say to me recently, Hong Kong has its own problems. Singapore's full. Where's the next sort of financial IT capital in Asia Pacific? WA's in the time zones. It's a great part of the world, and we can diversify our economy. So who knows what could happen? But this is going to create. In order for this to happen, it needs innovative, visionary political leadership.
Yeah. Well, mate, I really appreciate you coming on. I think you're one of them, and I like the thoughtful way you approach issues, and you certainly operate in more than sound bites. And look forward to catching up in future and turning this big ship around. Appreciate it.
Great to spend the time with you, Dan. Thank you.
Cheers.